subject of interest and importance to us all. So with that, Karen?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to give this talk today. I'd like to take a break from all of the enthusiastic discussion of control systems this week and talk for a few minutes about the people who develop control systems. Those of you who attended ICALEPCS in 2015 might remember a speaker who came from outside of the ICALEPCS community who asked the question in the closing session, why are there not very many women here? His implication was that we had a lot of women in the community and we just didn't let them attend the conference. And that led to some spawn-off discussions afterwards. But I think that the consensus seems to be that the conference more or less reflects the proportion of women in our community. And while we have very few women, we have even fewer minorities from certain groups. So today, I'd like to start a conversation about diversity in our field and take the opportunity to encourage engagement in understanding and improving the diversity in our community. So, what is diversity? Diversity is about variety in society, in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces. Despite all the discussion of social diversity is often discussed in terms of differences such as gender, race, age, disabilities, gender identity, sexual preference, religion, and even socioeconomic status. Despite all these differences, it's important to remember that we really have a lot more in common than not. As controls professionals, it's easy for us to understand the importance of professional diversity when it comes to our work groups. We certainly need people who understand hardware and software. We need people who can work on operating systems, user interfaces, device control. Furthermore, as we weigh the pros and cons of developing control systems, we employ a variety of operating systems, hardware and software interfaces, computer platforms, and so on. Clearly, our jobs could be easier when we strictly minimize the number of different platforms we use or the number of different technologies for development. However, if we are too narrow in our platform and technology choices, we won't be able to meet the needs of our customers. So we introduce diversity in our technology choices for our control systems. Thinking more broadly, let's consider the importance of social diversity in our work groups and professional community. By including people with socially diverse characteristics in our groups, we begin to capture diverse ideas, approaches, and solutions. So why is it important? Diversity is important because we can be better, more successful, and more creative working in diverse teams. Studies indicate that when innovation is important, diverse work teams are more successful than their non-diverse counterparts. While we clearly appreciate the necessary diversity of skills and technologies needed to build effective control systems, we don't think so much about the diversity in our work groups, and we underplay the value of social diversity. Looking around, we're mostly white, we're mostly male, one or the other or both. But rather, even if you're not white or you're not male, I think all of us bring to mind an image of a scientist or an image of an engineer, or as we heard Tuesday, the image of an inventor as a white male, perhaps working in isolation, not viewing it as the collaborative, interactive environment that our community thrives on. We have, in fact, by default, established a mental normative type for accelerator controls professionals. A well-functioning socially diverse group benefits from different backgrounds, different perspectives and life experiences of the members. Such groups bring a more comprehensive set of ideas to the table, and with those ideas, better processes for evaluating designs, for doing development, for testing, for developing user interfaces. Nowadays, it's not uncommon to see investment from corporations into improving the diversity of their workforces. This is because corporations have been paying attention to studies that say that their diverse work groups can increase profits for their company. So corporations now think it's important enough to their bottom line that they should spend money on these programs. I'm not sure they figured it all out yet because the programs aren't always effective, but they're certainly trying. So why can diverse teams be so much more effective? In 2014, Scientific American published an article that referred to a number of different studies about diversity and concluded that diverse teams simply work harder. When someone presents a new idea or a design, let's say, to a room full of people who look and live the same way that they do, It's a natural human tendency to assume acceptance. We are comfortable. That same presenter, faced with a socially diverse group, assumes they need a better presentation. They need to be better prepared to gain consensus when they're dealing with people from different backgrounds. And they do, in fact, come better prepared and more open to discussion. The article concludes that a diverse set of team members stimulates all team members to perform better. They attribute the effect to a person's lower comfort level with their peers. Yes, diversity can make us uncomfortable. So what's the current situation? In these pie charts, we see a representation of the US workforce by gender, race, and ethnicity, and then we see the breakdown of the STEM workforce. And so what we have is a US labor force that's almost half female, half male, 17% Hispanic, 12% Black, and 6% Asian. In the small community of accelerator controls professionals, we primarily hire college graduates with degrees in computer science, electrical engineering, or perhaps another STEM major like physics. These charts show how the diversity of our population is not mirrored in the STEM workforce. For example, white men are 31% of the population, but 49% of the STEM workforce. Asian men and women are also represented in the STEM workforce in greater proportion than the population. All other groups are underrepresented. About 30% of the STEM workforce is female, 33% is not white. Looking at our universities, these graphs show a breakdown of science degrees and engineering for women, for African Americans, and for Hispanics by science discipline. And what we see here is engineering and physics get far less participation from all of these groups than any other science major, and then mathematics. Unfortunately, these charts don't show computer science, but the current situation with women in computer science is about 17% female. And unlike all these other trend lines that are pretty much going up since 1995, in 1984, female participation in computer science peaked at around 35% and has been going down ever since. This is really the most disappointing trend. We see for African Americans, they haven't gone up over that same period of time. There have been some bumps, but in particular for math and statistics, they have made a big dip. So the trend here is not good. And for Hispanics, the trend is upward, but hasn't achieved sort of the same slope of the line as some of the women's science studies have. Women have been perhaps most successful in biology. 59% of all biology degrees in the US are now earned by women. What does it look like for DOE labs? So very recently, DOE started publishing on their website diversity data by job category, by gender, and by race and ethnicity. So when DOE does their data collection, they put two groups for non-whites. They have underrepresented minorities, which consists of African Americans, Blacks, Hispanics, and Latinos. So that is the green pie slice. And OPC is other people of color, so Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. So that's the groupings that DOE and in fact some other government US data uses. So what we see is for all staff at DOE labs, and there's about 57,000 people represented here, we're 31% female workforce and 69% male. We're 73% white, 17% other underrepresented minorities, and 10% other people of color. And keep in mind that this is not just science and engineering positions. This is all positions at national labs. So that includes HR, finance, IT support, things like that, what we call support functions. Another thing that we should remember is computer science and engineering, these tend to be difficult majors, physics. So relatively few students of any color or any gender ever select these majors. Only about 8% of all college degrees in the US are awarded in STEM fields. So while women get 60% of all college degrees, they only get about 34% of the STEM degrees. So when we go a little further into the DOE data, and look just at the job categories and the genders. So for the purposes of this graph, I did not include support positions, so only research, science, engineering positions. So this represents all jobs, so support positions are here. And support positions feed senior leadership, but there's no support positions here in the technical side. So what we see here is we've got a really healthy balance between males and females for undergraduate students employed by the national labs. It's over 40%. That's great. So what's happening? That's more than the percentage of STEM degrees that women earn. So we're getting these people where other corporations maybe are not. Unfortunately, we have the big purple line, which says that as the undergraduate students progress into graduate work, we go down below 30%. As we go to postdocs, we're down to about 23%. Becoming a technical or research staff member, 20%. Getting into management, so you're losing, some percentage points at every step of the way. We call this the leaky pipeline. With minorities, we have two different trends. So one is the green bars. So the yellow bars represent whites. The green bars are the underrepresented minorities, so primarily African Americans and Hispanics. So here we've got 30% undergraduate students, which is also great compared to the rate at which they earn degrees. But that drops by half by the time we get into graduate studies, and half again for postdoctoral positions. We get a little bit of bump for research staff, which might imply that some of these people are moving right from undergraduate into the workforce and not pursuing advanced degrees. But then we go down again for management positions and senior leadership. The blue bars represent other people of color, so primarily Asians. Here we don't have as many for undergraduate or even for graduate school, but we've got a lot of postdocs. This goes like way up. And then it goes dramatically down again for research staff, and then follows the same pattern getting into management and leadership. And one theory to explain the blue bars trajectory might be that a number of Asians will earn their bachelor's and even their master's degree in their home country, come to the US for their PhDs, and then return to their home country after completing a postdoc. When you look at senior leadership, these numbers also include people from support staff as well as the research side, so there is not a direct mapping. But these trends where we start out with a bunch of students and we lose them is something that I think we need to work to understand and come up with better retention strategies, better development strategies for these employees. I want to take a few minutes and talk about some of the early pioneers in our field. Many influences keep the participation of women and minorities low in computing and engineering fields, but there's some exceptions, and it hasn't always been that way. In the first picture, we have Ada, the Countess of Lovelace, who was born over 200 years ago in England to a privileged family. She also married into a privileged family. And her mother, unlike most girls in the UK at that time, studied math. She was an accomplished mathematician, and she insisted that Ada study math. This was highly unusual for girls at this time. Only girls of rich families or of noble families were educated at all, and then it was very rare that they would study math or science. It was considered not necessary. But her mother insisted she study math. She believed that this would prevent Ada from inheriting insanity from her father, the famous poet Lord Byron. Ada is credited with creating the first computer programs in the form of algorithms for the analytical engine, which was being built by Babbage. He never finished it. But nonetheless, it established theoretical work that led and fed into later computing efforts. Well, Babbage thought of the analytical engine as what we might consider the functions of a handheld calculator today. Ada had a much bigger vision for the machine. She said that data could be expressed, or that things beyond numbers could be expressed as digital data. Things like music, things like photographs, text. And then the computer would be able to manipulate these things. So her theory was that you could perhaps have a computer compose music, where Babbage thought computers would manipulate numbers only. She published her work under her initials rather than her name because it was not considered proper for a woman of her status to engage in such an unfeminine profession. The programming language, Ada, was named after her. Then we have Grace Hopper. About 100 years later, she got a PhD in math and was one of the early programmers on the Mark I computer. When America got involved in World War II, she wanted to join the Navy so that she could help with the war effort. But at 34 years old, she was too old. So she joined the Naval Reserves, and she did work with the Navy throughout the war, and in fact continued in her reserve position when she went back to industry when the war was over. Grace Hopper wrote the first compiler. She believed computer code should be human readable and inspired the programming language COBOL. She retired from the reserves at age 60 as was mandated, but was later recalled. It did require an act of Congress to allow her to work past the mandatory retirement age. She finally retired for good at age 79 as a Rear Admiral. She believed that mentoring students was her most important accomplishment after creating the first compiler. Alan Turing, famous British mathematician born in 1912, sometimes called the father of modern computing for his pioneering work. You've heard of the Turing machine. He wrote papers and theories about artificial intelligence. He went to work for the British Intelligence Service during World War II, where he was instrumental in breaking the German Enigma code. In 1952, he was prosecuted by the British government for his crime of homosexuality and lost his security clearance, which severely limited his future work. In 1954, he died of cyanide poisoning, thought to be self-inflicted. These examples give us a glimpse into a few of the brilliant and unique individuals whose contributions to the field of computing could not be diminished by their non-traditional gender, age, or sexual preference. Ironically, computer programming was first considered women's work. Men built the hardware, women programmed the computers. Programming was considered clerical in nature. So companies hired women and paid them much less than the men they hired to work on the hardware. But the reality was, they started to realize it required mathematical skills, analytical skills, higher level logic concepts. And as programming began to be recognized as a profession in and of itself, and salaries went up and prestige went up, men started becoming programmers in numbers greater than the women and now dominate the field. So, what are some reasons why our numbers might be limited these days? You know, there are legal reasons. You know, we have a history of laws that perpetuate legal discrimination. There are cultural issues. There is the whole culture that depicts engineers and computer professionals in the media as white males. And this goes back to the time when the personal computer was introduced around the early to mid-'80s. So ads for the first personal computers had men using the computers. It was rare for a woman to appear at all, but here we say she's taking care of the dishes while the man works on the computer. There are even ads that depict fathers showing their sons how to use the computer, but none showing the fathers using with their daughters, or mothers using the computer, or women at all using the computer. Here we have an ad for a programmer that some company lost, and they lured him back with rewards, like this attractive young lady here at his side. And over here, the ad talks about how a computer can save you having to hire so many engineers, but of course all the engineers in the picture look pretty much the same. So, you know, when you have media and messages from society and culture, you're constantly bombarded with this stuff. It makes it hard for children who are female or who are not white to picture themselves in these occupations. For centuries, voting rights and education were denied to women and to minorities in America and in other countries. Even as laws changed, other barriers continued to limit the rights of minorities to vote. Women in America have only had the right to vote for about 98 years. But these kinds of laws perpetuate all male power structures with little motivation to change, and the lack of equal education still shows. We know that children whose parents did not go to college are much less likely to go to college. If they do go to college, they're less likely to complete their degree. They lack role models locally. So discrimination, although largely outlawed on the books in many places, continues to play a role. Culture, society, people are treated differently, even from birth, based on cultural norms associated with gender, race, and ethnicity. Women and minorities suffer from a lack of recognition, encouraging role models, and mentors. Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, wrote a book called Lean In, where she discusses women in leadership. She describes how teachers and even well-meaning parents react differently to assertive children. Boys, who are pushing the other children around on the playground, are born leaders, and their behavior is encouraged. Girls who exhibit the same behaviors are called bossy and encouraged to stop. And I have to tell you how true this is. When I read this part of the book, I almost cried because I should know better. And this is exactly what I did to my daughter. My daughter's a born leader, and I called her bossy. And so did my husband. And yeah, for those of you who have met my daughter, she's exceptional. And I apologized to her after I read this, and I've never called her bossy again. We also have to deal with bias. So everybody knows about explicit bias, you know. For whatever reason, you don't like a certain type of person, a certain group of people, and you act accordingly. More insidious is something we call implicit bias. These are the biases that we're unaware of, unconscious biases. Everybody has them. I have them. You have them. We know from studies that people can have biases without realizing it, and people act on these biases also without realizing it. Orchestra auditions used to be conducted on an open stage with a panel of judges in the audience. This type of audition resulted in about 5% female selection for orchestras. Eventually, auditions and now are held behind an opaque curtain, and the musicians remove their shoes before they audition. So the judges won't have visual or auditory clues as to the gender of the musician. We now have over 30% females in orchestras. So these biases can impact who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets mentored, who gets all kinds of other resources, and are a strong factor in narrowing our pipeline. We also have bias built into our governments, our organizations, our support systems. The US still kind of hangs on to this culture where women stay home and have children and raise the children and take care of things at home, and the man leaves the home and makes a living and supports the family. And that's a wonderful model if that's what your family chooses and wants, but there's all kinds of families choosing other models where either both parents work. There's a lot of families that are headed by a single parent, male or female, and sometimes you have men that want to stay home and raise the children while the woman is in the workforce. But our policies and our tax structure, our child care resources simply don't support those other models very well. The US is the only wealthy nation in the world that lacks paid maternity and paternity leave, and in some cases even sick leave. So what can we do? We might find, as a starting point, we can examine our biases. So there's an excellent tool online from Harvard University where you can take a test and they will tell you what your biases are. It's not perfect, but it's a good starting point. We can hold ourselves accountable to be fair in the way we treat others, regardless of their gender, race, religion, age. We can raise awareness at work, have these discussions with your colleagues, improve awareness, and help to move to a more inclusive environment. If you're in a position where you hire people, ensure you use a fair process. From job ads to resume screening to interviews, bias can be introduced at every step of the way. I don't advocate to hire somebody simply based on social diversity. You should always hire the best possible candidate that you can get. But does your pipeline, does your application pool include diverse candidates? If not, that's something you can work on. You can mentor somebody who's different than you. You can be a role model in your community. You can volunteer at science fairs and in the schools to provide role models for children. Particularly in poor communities, children graduate from high school, 18 years old. They may have never met anybody with a college degree beyond the teachers and administrators at their school, doctors and nurses, and maybe a law enforcement official. So getting out there in the community and promoting engineering and computer science as professions that are viable for children who have good math skills, regardless of their gender or their race, is important. And for girls in particular, they want jobs where they feel like they help people. So you can emphasize the point that engineering really makes the world a better place to be. Give credit where credit is due. Women and minorities report feeling invisible at work, and even when making significant contributions. They report being talked over at meetings, that their ideas aren't valued. that they put forward an idea at a meeting, and the meeting goes on. 10 minutes later, somebody else puts forward the same idea, and it's a great idea. Everybody forgot that she said it first. So think about that. In conclusion, much in the way that we heard about the mythical inventor on Tuesday, the white male working in isolation, I contend that we as a community have by default established a mental normative type for controls professionals. Like normative types in EPIC 7, other types are not excluded, but they're more difficult. They're not supported, they're not provided for. To use a non-normative type, you have to do a lot more work yourself. This analogy implies non-traditional controls professionals carry the bulk of responsibility to make things work and overcome barriers. I contend that we should all be responsible for making diversity work. I encourage you to evaluate your groups and your organizations from the perspective of diversity. If you find your organization is doing well, I would love to know how you've accomplished that. On the other hand, if you see room for improvement, I encourage you to engage our community towards solutions and to look outside of our community for what is working in other places. While we may have limited power to change government and institutional barriers to diversity, we have tremendous power to act fairly and fill our pipeline and flow our pipeline. We can improve diversity one career at a time. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. We have a few minutes for questions, please.
So looking at the figures, when you say that you have this percentages of people from the Hispanic and from the female, I mean, typically a society is approximately 50% female and 50% men, right?
Yes.
But what about the portion? Is that normated in those graphs that you see how many, I don't know how many in the US are from, has a Latino background or a...
So the first set of pie charts shows that. So I don't know if I can go back.
That.
We can go back a little bit. So this is the proportion in the American workforce of males and females by gender, race, and ethnicity. And then this is the proportion in the STEM occupations. So here you can see, black women are almost 7% of the population, Hispanic men, and so forth and so on.
Okay, so thank you. Because
Sure.
Looking at the figures from also the facility world, the DOE, it's that should also be taking into account how many there are to choose from the beginning.
Right.
This is what I mean. So
Yeah.
so maybe the 69 plus versus the 31% women versus men it tells you something, but the other one is going to be more difficult to say.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So, when I was working on this, it's incredibly hard to find self-consistent data for comparison. This data set shows you this, but not that. And it's hard to find things that aren't apples and oranges. So I limited the data to use for things that I could find that were really consistent within that data set.
Okay, I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Two, there, three. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Something that I am starting to hear about in the industry world, especially like computer programmers, is doing blind hiring.
Yes.
Where from the start it's much like the audition for the orchestra, and that seems like it's a nice model. Do you think that can be applied to lab engineers?
Yes. So actually, in my paper where I go into some more detail, I talked about one thing you can do is work with your HR department to anonymize the resumes, names and other things that might indicate gender or ethnicity. So the first screening takes place just based on education and experience. And then obviously when you interview people, you will have visual clues. But, some people get dropped in the screening process, like you described, just because of the mental model. Oh, it's not what a control system engineer is like. So yes, I believe that could play a role. Also, think about the words that you use in your job postings sometimes are more encouraging or off-putting to one race or gender than the other. Yeah.
Thanks.
One more question. There's sorry. There is only time for one more.
Hi. I wondered how the methods you suggested, like for anonymization from the resumes and such, could be applied to, the current things like their algorithms governing our everyday lives, like credit scores or like our interview pre-selection. Do you have any opinion on how this anonymization could still be used with machine learning, for example, which is the current trend to do these kind of things?
Yeah, so I didn't come across anything that used algorithms to select interview candidates, for example. Certainly something that, since we are into algorithms and computing, we might think about, as a community. But, anytime you have a lot of human involvement in the selection process, it's going to be somewhat subjective, and, that's kind of what we're facing. So I think at the end of the day, we have to train ourselves to understand our biases and not apply those in an unfair way to our workforce or to our potential workforce.
Thank you.
Thank you.